a number of big diplomatic trips recently to the continent of Africa. We've seen both the Turkish and the Chinese foreign ministers go. We've seen, on the American side, Antony Blinken, Janet Yellen, Jill Biden, and now recently Kamala Harris go. And we've also seen Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, go. What's going on? Why, all of a sudden, is everyone obsessed with the continent of Africa?
And that's what African leaders are asking themselves, and they're delighted. There they are, being courted like the most beautiful woman in the world. And you look at Qin Gang, he's the new Chinese foreign minister. He went to Africa in January. That was the first trip he made. Sergei Lavrov, I think he might, be buying a house somewhere because he's been to 7 African countries this year. And then there's Kamala Harris, who's the most recent. And she was playing catch-up. She went to 3 countries. I think it's a number of different things, but the main thing is Ukraine. It's because Africa has 54 votes at the UN, and the Americans, the Europeans, want those votes for condemning Russia. Russia wants those votes on its side. And the African countries playing pretty hard to get. Most of them have abstained in these votes, and they are not willing to go on the Western side and condemn Russia. They're hedging their bets because they know that they're wanted.
Now, the reason why partly African nations won't immediately side with the West when it comes to the Ukraine war is to do with history and the scramble for Africa. Europeans began arriving in Africa from the 15th century. But in 1884, the major European powers met to essentially carve up the continent between them, ensuring that they all had territory and also to avoid any war between the rival nations. This was the Age of Empire. After the Second World War, African nations began to fight for their independence against European colonial rule. And because these powers were often on the side of the Americans, the Soviet Union aided many freedom movements across the country. The Cold War saw the East and West fight over Africa, and one could argue that those memories still last today. And indeed, the present battles that we're talking about today over who has the most impact and influence on the continent mirrors, in some ways, the old battles of the past. And we have discussed that before on the podcast, but I mean, that has to do partly with the history of Africa, colonialism, the Cold War, in terms of why some African nations won't necessarily want to side with the West and Ukraine.
Yes, that's true. But also Russia is making this big push at the moment in Africa. They are actively going out there. And it comes at a time when, look, we talk about Africa as if it's one place. Of course, there are many different countries, and within African countries you have governments, you have civil society, you have business people, and people have a different perspective. But broadly speaking, whereas Western governments are very keen on spreading democracy and human rights, and many African governments would say lecturing them about human rights and the environment and so on, and they would say unjustly, particularly if they're former colonial powers like France or Britain. The Russians and the Chinese are in there courting the votes, and also particularly with the Chinese, a lot of trade, a lot of investment and so on. So there's a huge push at the moment, and African countries are very open to it.
Looking at Russia, China, as you say, and then also we are going to mention Turkey, who also have involvement within the continent. Is that because all those countries, in their own way, whatever they're doing, see the continent as a way, as offering the opposite of what the West is doing? As you say, human rights, democracy. They say, well, actually, there's a different way of a different global order that there could be.
Definitely, because British leaders and, the American president, they quite often say Russia is isolated. This is not true. Russia may be isolated when it comes to Europe and the Western world. It is not isolated in the global south. And so what have we seen in Africa in the last few months? We've seen naval exercises by Russia and China and South Africa off the South African coast. So that doesn't look very isolated, does it? And we've seen an increasing amount of Russian information or propaganda, which is available in Africa. So let's take Uganda. Uganda is a really interesting example. So President Museveni came into power in 1986. He's been there a long time. And he was initially seen as quite pro-Western and was certainly, backed by the West, got a lot of Western aid. And he has, over the years, I think, become more impatient with the West and not happy with what the West has said, not least because he has not been as democratic as he initially indicated he was going to be. I mean, he's still in power. He's been there a long time. And he's grooming his son. He's very senior in the army, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, possibly to succeed him. So what do the Russians do? The Russians went in to see senior people in the government, including the Russian cultural attaché, whose name, you will be glad to know, is Mr. Kalashnikov. And they went in and said, look, there's these attack helicopters which we're providing to you, and Russia provides 50% of the arms to Africa in general. And, we'd like to put some stuff on your television, Russia Today, that kind of thing. And the Ugandans were fine with that. So the Russian narrative about Ukraine is very strong in Uganda. It has had a big impact. And, the Ugandans are quite happy with that. And then Muhoozi, the son, I mean, he and I follow each other on Twitter, and I sent him a message. This was quite a while back now. I sent him a message because his narrative is very popular and it's out there. And now I see that Museveni is going to the Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg, which is in July. He made a speech where he said how strong relations with Russia had been over the years. They had only had a small gap after the Soviet Union fell apart under Gorbachev. In other words, at the point when the West was very in there. Other than that, he said, our relationship goes back 100 years. It's a marvelous thing. So you can see how the information war, I would say at the moment, Russia is winning it.
Since the war in Ukraine began, many African nations have officially remained neutral. At the UN General Assembly vote on March the 2nd last year, so that's just after the war began, 17 African nations abstained from condemning Russia's invasion. 8 didn't vote at all, and 1 African country, Eritrea, voted against the resolution. 28 African nations voted to condemn Russia. Then, in February this year, almost a year later, at a UN resolution calling on Russia to immediately withdraw its troops from Ukraine, 15 African nations abstained from voting once again, with Mali and Eritrea voting against. And also, interestingly, at the same time, Uganda is in America's bad books because they were very vocal about the new anti-LGBT laws in Uganda.
Now, that is also interesting because those LGBTQ issues. So that has come up over the last, 20 years as a big issue in Africa. And I once had, this was long ago, 20 years ago, a conversation with Museveni about it. And this was a conversation just the two of us. He was not particularly anti-gay. Then you had a lot of American preachers, right-wing American preachers, anti-gay preachers came in and really pushed this line. And so that became, very popular. But now, who's pushing the anti-LGBTQ line across the world? It's Russia. Because Putin sets himself up as this family values guy against the decadent West with all these terrible feminists and gay people, and they teach their children not to, know what gender they are. They're all pedophiles. This is the stuff you hear from Kremlin propaganda. This is the stuff that you're hearing across Africa. And now we have this LGBTQ law in Uganda, which is very much part of the Russian playbook.
When it comes to that idea of this battle over the continent between, America and Russia, China, etc., does it feel like, with countries like Uganda that the West is losing? Because then also we have groups like the Wagner Group in Africa, the private military that's helping the Russian army in Ukraine. They've been focusing recently, when it comes to propaganda, on Niger, on the Ivory Coast. Does it feel like those are the countries it's trying to switch them from democracies?
Well, it's not just switching them from democracies, because a lot of the countries where Wagner is involved are fighting jihadis. So, it's mostly in West Africa, French-speaking West Africa. So there's a huge jihadi problem in Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, all across there. Now, one of the reasons I think that Kamala Harris went to Ghana is because there's a great concern that this may start to happen in Ghana, which, has those borders. And she offered a lot of American aid to all of those countries to fight the jihadis. But take Mali, which has had 2 coups and is therefore in the bad books of the West because it's not democratic. So to be honest, when it was democratic, I don't know what good that did the people in Mali. When I went there, they didn't seem to be benefiting from democracy. They seemed to be as poor and miserable as ever. And the French were in there, and they went in, Operation Barkhane in 2013 to push the jihadists back. And I remember being there, and everybody was waving French flags. They were so keen on France, which was helping them defeat the jihadists. And the jihadists were horrible. And they really, treated people incredibly badly. Now they're waving Russian flags, and France was forced to leave. France is now seen as a terrible colonial power. You look at Burkina Faso. There was a coup in Burkina Faso, and once again, they're waving Russian, not French flags. I have to say, actually, all you have to do is you've got the same colours, haven't you? So you just have to change it from going vertical stripes to horizontal. So if you've got the wrong flag, it's not too difficult to change it. But the point is that these governments, what are they getting from Russia? Well, they're getting money from Russia for the elites. And they're not being told off about their human rights records and the environment or anything like that at all. And they can let the Russian Wagner group go and do what it wants to. And they say they've had some success defeating the jihadis. I'm not sure about that, but we can certainly say that the French failed to defeat the jihadis, and the UN. It didn't work. The jihadis are still strong.
We've talked about the Russians. What about the Chinese when it comes to what they're doing, especially militarily when it comes to the continent of Africa? We talked about them having military drills with the Russians and the South Africans. But they opened their first military facility outside of China in Djibouti. So what are they thinking? Well,
Djibouti, it's a bit crowded, Djibouti, with all these different military facilities. Of course, the French have been there forever, and then there's the Americans. So that is a very strategic position in the Horn of Africa there between, Africa and the Middle East and looking out over the Indian Ocean. But for the Chinese, I think their interest is still primarily commercial and economic. So you look at Russia, it provides almost no foreign direct investment, less than 1% of Africa's foreign direct investment. But China is a really major partner for African countries when it comes to trade and when it comes to investment. And they're doing an awful lot on building infrastructure, on building roads, on building rail, on building hotels, on building airports. And, you want a road built in your country. The Russians aren't going to do it. The West is going to be far too expensive. And anyway, they have all those pesky environment thingamybobs that you have to do first, Chinese will come in and they'll build your road and it'll be a good road.
What's China's thinking there? Is it completely benevolent in saying, look, we'll build your roads and your bridges and whatever and ensure that you can get from A to B? Or is it double-sworded in the sense that they're also thinking about those are also going to help us extract certain minerals, whatever, that we need to grow our economy?
Well, I think it's both, and they would call that win-win. And that's what one of the phrases that the Chinese often use, that this is win-win. And I think that it's also about Chinese companies, because this is money for Chinese companies. If you provide aid to an African country for a road, but it's the Chinese company that's building the road, then that's an investment in your own company as well as in Africa. And I think at first there was a lot of complaints. When I first started to look at this in the mid-2000s, around 2006, there were a lot of complaints by African countries about Chinese labour being brought in instead of them providing employment for people in different African countries. I think that's changed to some extent, and I think that there are a lot more. They do create a lot more jobs than they used to. They used to create. At the beginning, I think the West's view of Chinese investment in Africa was very colonial. And it was like, well, what are these people doing coming here when we own this part of the world? And the answer is, hey, these people have a lot to offer. African countries need this investment in this infrastructure, and the Chinese are the people who are offering it at a reasonable price. But something has come up in the last year or so, which is about debt. And some of these infrastructure projects are financed by debt. And some African countries, notably Zambia, have defaulted on the debt.
And so Zambia is a really interesting one because of the anger there over them defaulting on the debt. We then saw a new president come in 2021, I think. And so do the Americans now see that as a route in? That there's been a backlash against China? And also, obviously, Zambia is quite important when it comes to minerals used for, I think, was it electric batteries?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's cobalt, there's cobalt, there's copper. I mean, Zambia's a terribly poor country, but it does have a lot of natural resources. And one of the complaints about China is about it extracting natural resources and not processing anything on site. And it was interesting because Kamala Harris went to Zambia, and one of the things she said was, well, we're going to invest in factories and so on, which will process some of this stuff in Zambia, which obviously provides jobs and prosperity and so on. So you have that idea. But Hichilema, I think, is a much more Western-looking leader than the last couple of presidents of Zambia. He's been quite clear that he looks to the West and not to China. So it is a change of orientation. And I presume that's one of the reasons that Kamala Harris went to Zambia, because it's a country that they're trying to nurture. But I would say, through all of this and this, new scramble for Africa, what about Zambians? Are they getting any more prosperous than ever they were? I'm not sure they are. It's still a very poor, underdeveloped country with most people living off the land and, high infant mortality rates and not doing so well.
And similar with the DRC, which also is incredibly mineral rich but incredibly poor.
Yeah, that's much worse than Zambia. But Zambia is smaller and has a much greater chance of having the kind of governance which could improve people's lives. I mean, the DRC, has wars going on, in different places, and much more intervention from the neighbours, including Rwanda. It's a much more fraught and difficult, underdeveloped country. But yeah, I mean, one would like to see all of this interest in Africa being leveraged and being used, for the benefit of African people, not just for the benefit of elites and for governments and armies that want shiny new weapons.
Because going back to when we first started talking about, China and its investment in infrastructure in the continent, are there countries that China would point to, Beijing would point to and say, actually, if you look at that country, we have increased their GDP, we have increased people's standard of living.
Yeah, Angola. And on paper, Angola's gone massively up, but that's because Angola has huge amounts of oil, most of which go to China. But Angola is very, very deeply in debt to China now, and it's still not particularly well run, and there's still a lot of poor Angolans.
Let's talk about Turkey, because I don't think many people often think that Turkey's actually sort of been looking at the continent for quite a while under President Erdogan. What's his thinking there, then?
He went to Somalia in 2011, and he saw opportunities. And he saw opportunities for Turkish business and also for the Turkish airline. So, in the old days, if I was going to West Africa, from here, French Africa, I'd go Air France. I don't know what my luggage went, because it never turned up on the same flight in the same place at the same time.
That's why you always have hand luggage then.
Yeah, you see, I only have hand luggage, as I usually do. But the camera equipment, I mean, I could go into the story about the time we landed in the DRC and all the camera equipment had gone missing. And we ended up hiring a camera, and then we discovered that the camera came from an EU-funded democracy project, and I have a horrible feeling that we took the democracy program off the air for the week that we borrowed or rented that equipment from somebody who probably had no right to rent it out to us. Anyway, now we always go Turkish Airlines, and which is pretty efficient. And in 2000, I think Turkish Airlines went to 4 cities in Africa. Now it goes to 40. So that has been a huge expansion for Turkish Airlines, and that's obviously money, prosperity in Turkey. Turkey builds airports in Niger. They've built the airport there. It's an excellent airport. And Somalia, a lot of investment in Somalia, which is obviously a country which very few businesses would dare invest in because it's had endemic war for so many years. But they've built the port and they run and maintain it. The same with the airport. They've built hotels and so on. And this has been a very good investment.
We've talked about Russia, China, Turkey, looking at all these different countries on the continent. Has America just sort of, for the last couple of decades, completely forgot to actually even focus on Africa as a continent? And allowed others to sort of encroach on...
Well, I think it's to do with how they look at Africa.
Yeah.
And I think that this is true for America and certainly for Britain as well. People tend to look on Africa, I think, not as a place of opportunity or of equal partnership, but a recipient of aid and charity, and a place that needs to jolly well pull up its socks and, do better on the human rights. I can remember, this is quite a long time ago, Linda Chalker, who used to be a minister for Africa under a Tory government way back. I used to listen to her in Africa, and I used to think, God, she sounds like the netball captain, Come on, you can do better over there, Uganda. Kenya, I can see you out of the corner of my eye. Now, that's not nice. That there is that patronising way of looking at Africa, I think. I was talking to somebody the other day who'd been a minister in the South African government at one point, and she said, look, the Americans, they come in with all of these conditions. They want this, they want that. And at the end of it, you think, okay, keep your money. Just keep your money. And so it's not so much taking the eye off the ball, but looking at Africa in a particular way. And because of that, just falling back.
If we look at the current situation, which is relations between Beijing and Washington sort of getting lower and lower, and Africa in some ways becoming this continent which is at the heart of them battling it out, is there not an argument to say, well, actually, if it weren't for those worsening relations, those two could actually come together, not in some sort of new Cold War, but in a sort of mutual competition to try and actually work together to utilize the resources of the continent to not only better the people in Africa, but also in terms of their own global market? Or am I being too optimistic?
Oh, you're an idealist, aren't you, Kieran? It's lovely.
But is it just the continent stuck again in two great powers' war?
Well, two great powers and one lesser power.
Yeah.
Because the Russians are the ones who are really in the ascendant at the moment. It's about the relationships between those countries outside of Africa, isn't it? So you have the great power competition between China and America. And that is going to be the story of the next century, or at least half century. That is going to happen. And Russia, I would say, is something that's sort of come in on the side, as it were. But China obviously sees Russia as an important ally against the West. And then Africa is just a place where it gets played out. I mean, it's the old thing, elephants in the grass, isn't it?
So, I mean, I guess finally, some would argue this is sort of some sort of 21st century scramble for Africa as it was in the 19th century. Are we not just, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, whatever. Is this not the same thing where, as you've said, people are fighting over Africa because of outside reasons and not thinking about those who actually live within that continent? So we are just, again, repeating history.
Yeah, but also then it depends, what do African governments do about it? So there is an argument which says, if I'm the foreign minister of X country and everybody's fighting over me, I've got a chance to do a really good bargain. And I have a chance to do it in a way that, brings investment into my country and prosperity into my country. And then I can spend it on the people and on improving people's lives. And it would be great if we saw that happening somewhere. So really, this does give a lot of power to African leaders. Now the question is, what do they do with it?